All right. It is 2 after. So let's get started. Pull up the agenda here. And let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, should all be able to see my browser here. Patrick, looks like you got the first thing here on the agenda, so let's talk about that. You have a question about how to use a form with a method set to get rather than post.
Yeah, this actually came from the module I was looking at in phase 2. It's called posting data to the server with a form. And it says you should be able to, like, you make a form post page and a form get page, and you should be able to get the same result using a form, using a get or post method.
So is your question like how to write the HTML form so that it does a get instead of a post?
Yeah, and how to actually get that to, I guess, work, because right now I can get it to do a post and I can get the result, but I can't get the result using the get method instead of a post method on the HTML side.
Gotcha. So it sounds like you know how to change the method of the form from get to post. You just don't know how to like receive that on the server?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have like that code up in front of you? Do you want to just share your screen and we can walk through it? Would that be easiest?
Yeah, we can do that. I've got the code already opened up in Atom, so.
Great, let's do that.
Okay. Hold on. Let me just share my screen. Here we go. You can just ignore the test for now. So I've got this app with these different routes, and I have all the routes working except for this this form get one, which it will go there, but then on the HTML side, right here, that, and I have the method set to get, but then it won't actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
So here's what's happening. When you submit your form, right, it initiates a new HTTP request to your server with the path set to /submit form and the HTTP method set to get.
Yeah.
And if you look in your app.js, you have a route on line 33 that matches requests that come into /submit form with an with the HTTP method of post, but you don't have one that handles HTTP get methods for that same path.
Okay. What is line 28 doing then?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
It's right there in front of me. Okay, no, so that should be working. So when you run this, what's the behavior you're seeing? Are you getting an error somewhere? Or just
yeah, here, I can run it right now.
Yeah.
Okay, localhost. Was it form get, right? And then I try to post, whatever. And then I just get that empty.
Okay. And in your server logs, you don't have any errors or anything?
Nope.
Okay, let's look in your app.js one more time.
Okay.
It does look like your routes are good. Why don't we, I think I know what the reason is. Okay, so on line 29, so it looks like your response is just the submitted data and you're getting just an empty object.
Yeah.
I think the reason is when you post from a form, the data from that form, the inputs and their names get put into the body of the HTTP request. When you do a get from a form, all of those parameters get put into the query string for the get.
So if I change this to request.query,
yeah,
do you think that would work?
I think that would work.
Okay.
I think that would work. Yeah.
I got to restart it because I don't have NodeMon running.
Yeah, and you can see them up in the query string. After you submit the form, you should be able to see them in your browser. Yeah, see how they're up in the browser there, and the URL bar, and then
Okay, so is that the main difference then between a post and a, like between the methods post and get? Get will show it up in the query string, and post will.
Right. That's how. So when your browser submits a form and it sees that the method is get, the request that it's going to build is a get request. It's going to use that action, and it's going to take all of the inputs from your form and build a query string out of them. And that in the request. When it does a post, it'll put all that stuff in the body of the request. And it's kind of an HTTP convention that post requests can have a body, and generally, I don't know if it's strictly invalid for a GET request to have a body, but it's definitely not convention to put a body in your GET request, and I think it might even be invalid HTTP to like try and have a body in a GET request. So that's why it sticks it in the query.
Okay. Is there any? So for a post request, because it's not in the query string, I guess you can hide the information a little bit better. Is there any reason why you would ever use a get method as opposed to the post method if they achieve the same thing?
It is pretty unusual to have a form and then use a get method. Sort of semantically in the HTTP protocol, a post is sort of indicating that you're taking some action. You're sort of updating data. Where with a get, you're just fetching some resource. It's sort of this semantics there. So if you are really submitting a form, usually if you're submitting a form on a website, it's because you're sort of sending some data to the server that you want it to like take action on, right? Like log me in or buy this plane ticket or whatever. Save this document or email or whatever. So it's unusual to use a get in a form. It's not that you wouldn't do it. Obviously, you can do it. It's part of the HTML specification. But it's a little bit of an unusual case.
All right. Yeah. Thanks. That helped a lot.
Yeah. Great. Cool. Let's see what else we got here. So the next thing on the agenda is how to pass an output to a callback function from inside another function, / how to use callback functions. Is the person who added this to the agenda in the Zoom room at the moment? I made the mistake. Was that you, Fode?
No, it's not me. I'm not sure who it is, but it's not me, no.
Okay, all right. I may wait on that one then, so I don't, in case they show up late, I don't want to cover it before the person who asked it gets here. Unless there are other people who have that same question. If not, then for those of you who are here, if you have something you want to talk about, we can go to that. Anybody have anything in particular you're struggling with this week or wanted to look at? Okay. Would y'all be interested in talking about callback functions? I may go ahead and do this since this is being recorded for whoever asked it. They'd be able to watch the recording later.
Yeah, sure. Why not?
All right, let's talk about callback functions.
All right.
So how to pass an output to a callback function from inside another function. Okay, without the original author of that question here, I'm going to have to make some assumptions about what that means. But let me share my screen and we can get into this here. Why don't we gonna make some JavaScript. Y'all can see my JavaScript here. Well, my empty file.
Yep.
Okay, great. So let's talk about callback functions. So if I'm making a callback function, what's a good example of a callback function? For now, we'll just say add later. So maybe we want to make an add function that adds two numbers together asynchronously. So might implement that something like set timeout and result equals A plus B. So this is, you know, we've got a function that's doing something asynchronously, right? And then it provides this callback to get the result. So the question is how to pass an output to a callback function from inside another function. And if I'm understanding that right, if the question is like, how do you sort of return a value from an asynchronous function? How do you like pass a value to the callback? Your callback is going to come in here as just an argument, and then you can just call that callback function and pass it whatever the result of your function is. So I might do something like this, so that later I can say, yeah, let's make this happen a second later. So later I can call add later with A plus B, and then provide my own callback, right? That's going to get the result. And let's just log the result here. So if I run this, A is not defined. If I run this, I have to pass in numbers here. Silly me. We're going to add 2 and 88. There we go. And we'll get 90 after a second. So what's happening there is, and maybe some logs would be helpful here. So logs, we can log here that A plus B is result. And then we can say calling the callback. And then down in here, inside the callback, we can say inside the callback. You can sort of see the order that this gets executed in. So what should happen is that add later gets called. We pass in this function here as a callback. That gets assigned to this callback argument, and 2 gets assigned to A, and 88 gets assigned to B. And then we do a set timeout, and we do this asynchronous work here, where after a second, this asynchronous, so after a second, this function will get run, right? And that function is going to add the numbers together and then sort of log out the numbers and what the result was. And then it's going to call callback, which is just this function down here, passing in result. So we'll receive result here, and then we'll log some stuff out and log the result. And that'll look like this. So here we are doing the work, and then we're calling callback. We get inside the callback, and then we print out the final result. So that's generally like, calling, setting output back in a callback. And you can imagine, set timeout here could be a database method, right? This could be like PG, run some database query, anything that's going to take some time. Set timeout's just a quick way to simulate that. And a common idiom that you'll see with callbacks in Node code especially is writing the callbacks to take 2 arguments instead of 1, where the first argument is an error, if an error happened. And usually you'll see something like this, error, throw error, or we sort of check for the error and throw it if we get one, otherwise we keep going. And in that case, your callback would look something like this, where you're passing null in as the first result because there's no error, right? And you might have some error case that you're testing for. So we might be able to say if type of, I always spell this wrong, type of A is not equal to number callback, and then you could call back with the error, new error. So that's sort of the full case if you're doing error handling as well. A lot of times you'll have, your callback takes 2 arguments, an error and then the result. So in your error case, you just pass the first argument, you pass an error. And we would want to return here to keep the rest of this from happening. And then if you don't get past that case, then you end up calling your callback with null and then the result. Handling it that way. So this should have the same result in our test case. It does. Maybe we can get rid of these console logs for clarity. But then if we try and do something silly, like pass in pizza, then we should see this error get thrown here. Excuse me, there we go. So our error sort of bubbles up here. Error is not a number. A is not a number. Anybody have questions about that? Or callbacks in general? Okay, cool. That's all we got on the agenda. But we got plenty of time, so I'm happy to stick around and talk more, look at other people's code.
Hey, Trevor, I had a question. If you can go back to the code, please.
Yeah.
On line, let's see here, on line 9, where then the callback, before you had the if case to test the type of, which is when we were passing results.
Mm-hmm.
The callback in the previous code, result was just a variable, a const variable that adds A to B.
Mm-hmm.
My question is that if result is just a variable that you define within the function scope, why would you want to pass that to the callback?
As opposed to just returning it?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a great question. So the reason is that this work is happening asynchronously. So let me go back to the way it was, just to simplify this, right? This will be easier to see. So it's kind of the case you're talking about. So we have result here, and your question is, instead of doing a callback, why don't we just return result? So the reason that we can't do this is that, so this return here on line 5 is inside another function that starts here on line 2. There's this anonymous function that I'm passing as a callback to set timeout. So if I return on line 5, I'm returning from this highlighted function. I'm not returning from add later. In fact, add later returns pretty much immediately. So maybe a better way to show this would be, sometimes I think these anonymous functions get a little confusing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, yeah, let's do this. So, add numbers equals function. So what's happening here is really more like this. So I'm writing, this code's going to be equivalent, but I'm taking this anonymous function and I'm going to give it a name, add number. And so I'm going to move it up here. So this code is equivalent. I'm just taking that anonymous function that I had in line there and just giving it a name up here, which hopefully will make this clear. So when I say return result, I'm returning from this add number function. So what happens if you sort of walk through the way this code works, we call add later with 2 and 88 and this callback, right? So as the computer's walking through our code, it's going to get in here, it's going to assign the right things to these 3 variables. It's going to define this add number function. It's not going to run it, it's just going to define the function. And then down here, it's going to pass that function to set timeout with 1,000 as the second argument. And then add later is going to return immediately. And we could see that if we add logging down here that says add later has completed. Right? So we're going to call add later, and as soon as add later is done, it's going to call add later has completed. And let's add some logging here that says callback has been called. Let me just turn this to its original state for a sec. So if we run this code, do this in a window like this so we can see it. Directory am I in? Good. Okay. So you see what happened was add later has completed gets printed almost immediately. And then at some later time, callback has been called gets called. And the reason for that is that, fix this up here. The reason for that is that, so add later, all add later does is define this function, it passes it to set timeout with a timeout of 1,000 milliseconds, and then it finishes. And set timeout doesn't do anything right away. It just sort of makes this note that like, okay, in 1,000 milliseconds, I'm gonna call this add number function, right? And so add later finishes immediately. So if we return result here, instead of calling this callback, what's going to happen is that that result gets returned, but it's getting returned to the code that's calling add number. And the code calling add number is the code that's the implementation of set timeout, right? So there's nothing listening for that return value of add number. It's just this thing that's been registered, hey, call add number in 1,000 milliseconds. So in like some other place somewhere, that timer is going to go off and add number is going to get called, but the return value is going to be ignored. It's too late for us to return something from the add later function because the add later function finished a long time ago. It finished almost 1,000 milliseconds ago. So even if we return it here, and we can see this by saying const add later return value. If we log out the add later return value, we should see that even with that return in there, the return value of add later is always undefined. Because this return isn't returning from add later, it's returning from add number. So, and that's why you have to pass in callbacks for asynchronous functions, because you have to have some way to get results back, because you can't just use the traditional like return, because those asynchronous functions actually return immediately. They just sort of set something up to happen in the future. And so the callback is your way to tell the asynchronous function, okay, when you set that thing up to happen in the future, whenever in the future it's done, please call this function. This is sort of the next thing I want you to do after you're done doing your work. So in this case, what we're saying is, okay, I want you to add these 2 numbers in the future, and whenever you're done adding those 2 numbers, you know, please execute this code, this callback here with the result. Does that clear it up a little bit?
Yes.
Yes, it does.
Awesome.
And I have a question.
Yeah.
You're just using callback just to let us know, like, hey, this is what I'm doing, but you can change that word callback. Callback isn't like a special keyword.
That's correct. Callback is not a keyword. Yeah, so sometimes you'll see me do this, CB, because who wants to type all those letters? I don't necessarily recommend having like super short variable names in production.
Right.
But yeah, you could call this anything you want. So yeah, we could call this Steve. As long as we use it in both places, the code will still work. Yeah. Thanks for asking. It's a good clarification. Sometimes it's hard to know what's magical and what's not, and callback in that case is not magical. It's just sort of a convention. What else?
Back to the project I was working on. I was actually trying to implement some testing to test the routes, and I was getting this weird bug when I was like setting everything up, and it says chai.request wasn't actually working from the chai.http docs.
Okay. Yeah, we can look at that if you want. I don't know that I'm as familiar with that specific library, but let's take a look at it. Maybe we can debug it.
Okay. Do you want me to share my screen again?
Yeah, please. Okay. Great. Oh, I may have to unshare my screen.
Okay.
Let's do that. Come on, Zoom. Get out my way. There we go.
Okay. Do this. So in my test, basically, I set up the node environment to be test, and then I require everything. And then I have this app.express app. I just have set here, or where is it? I have it set here just to know that I'm pulling from the right file and pulling the right object, because I was following along with Jared's tutorial on this, and that's what he did to make sure he was testing the right object. And then the next test, though, is where I'm getting this error, where I'm just requesting that it goes to the home route, and then it should just have a status of 200. But then when I what am I? npm test. Yeah, I'm getting this request app.
Oh, so you're getting that's a
token.
Syntax error there. Can you go back to the error?
Yep, let me go back to the error.
So request app, so unexpected token, that open parenthesis, it does not like that. So let's the code and see why we might be getting a syntax error there. There's probably just a missing comma or closing parenthesis somewhere. Chai request.
Yeah, and I was looking at the chai HTTP documentation for installing it, and it said to, require chai HTTP and then chai.use.
Yeah, that looks right. I mean, with this syntax error like that, it's probably not a logical error. It's probably just like a typo somewhere. We've got some punctuation missing. So usually what I like to do with these, here we go. Yeah. So
is it this extra, or line 17 you said?
Yeah, on line 17, you've got end, open parenthesis, error response, close parenthesis, and then a fat arrow. And I think...
Oh, right. I forgot to put the function. Or no, wait.
Yeah, so I think you're missing, you need another opening parenthesis before error.
Okay.
It looks like end takes a callback, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you need another closing parenthesis on line 21. That's interesting. Where it was complaining about the syntax error kind of is surprising to me. It feels like, but I think try that. See if that works. At least get the syntax error.
Okay, yeah, there we go.
Hey, there we go.
Okay, yeah. All right, thanks.
Yeah, that was a confusing syntax error because it was complaining about like 2 lines away from where the problem really was.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, thanks for that. I was stuck on that for a while.
Yeah, those kind of things, honestly, like those types of syntax errors, if I haven't seen it in 5 minutes, I'm never going to. And I have to go get someone else to look at it and be like, why is it not working? You get so like, you look at the same code long enough and it's impossible to see those little things. You just need someone else to come over and stare at it with you.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. All right, folks. We're halfway through the hour. What else do you want to talk about? The crowd is growing. Woo! Excuse me. This cough I can't quite get rid of.
Are you okay?
Yeah, just this chest thing going on for 2 weeks. Small kids, they just keep getting you sick. I will try not to die. Thank you for your concern. Oh. All right, who else has something they want to look at? Questions, curiosities? Something interesting you learned this week that you'd like to share?
Well, I'm working on the digging deeper into JavaScript module, and I was going to start looking at a tutorial about this, call and apply. So I guess if you can give us any examples of that to better understand it, that'll be great.
Yeah, examples of this and call and apply, you said?
And bind, yes.
And bind, okay, yeah. Mm-hmm. That should be super fun and should test my, my memory. Let's see, let me share my screen again. Okay, so yeah, let's talk about this. So this is a concept in JavaScript that comes up when you're writing object-oriented JavaScript. So lots of ways to do that, but let's say that we were creating a dog class. So we're going to create a constructor and we're going to give the dog a name, say. And this we might use this way. We might say this dot name. And the way that works is, let's give this dog a method called speak. And so this is a little silly because dogs don't speak, but we're just going to roll it. So when dog speaks, we'll say it says sentence said, let's see, comma, said name. So, so let's see what's going on here. So I'm creating a constructor function called dog that takes a name. And when I invoke that constructor with the new keyword, and I say new dog name, we'll call this dog my pet, and we'll say the name is China because that's my dog's name. And then I can say pet.speak. Which is something my dog might say. So let's take a look and just run this, make sure that this code is even valid. The main line is here said China. I'm missing a space and some quotes around the sentence. So let's try and do this a little bit cleaner. And then we'll talk about it. So
Hey Trevor, I have a question. I've seen some people like, what's the difference here when you use here the pound sign and this one using like the dollar sign?
the pound sign is me typing it wrong. The dollar sign is what you're supposed to use. when you use this, like the $ brackets inside a string that's delimited by these backticks, then whatever's inside the brackets gets evaluated as JavaScript, and then the result gets printed in your string. And I always type it this way first, and the pound sign's just wrong. It's supposed to be the $, I think. Pretty sure about that. It's a common typo. Okay, there we go. So there's my nice output here. Okay, so what's going on here? When we say new dog China, we're telling JavaScript, I want to create a new object of the dog class, or really of the dog type. Might be a better way to say that. And I'm going to pass this argument to the constructor. And so what JavaScript will do is it will create a new object, and it'll stick it in this. Or rather, it'll create a new object, and then it'll make it available to you by using the this keyword in your constructor, right? So inside the constructor, I can reference the object that JavaScript just created for me using this, and then I can assign things to it, just like I would any other object. And what I get back is a reference to my object, which I'm calling pet, that'll have this .name attribute. The other thing that it'll have, the other thing that .this will have is it'll have all of the methods from its prototype. So here, when I say dog.prototype, prototype is an attribute of the constructor, right? So this function dog is itself sort of has object-like properties in JavaScript, right? It's a function, but I can assign attributes to it. And one of the attributes that all functions have or can have is prototype. And the prototype itself holds another object that has a bunch of keys that are names of functions that point to actual functions. So let's see if there's a better way to look at this interactively. What I'm going to do is, let's open up a node terminal and paste all that code in. Yay, okay. So now we can look at dog and prototype. If we look at the prototype on dog, we see that it's this object that has a speak attribute, right? Because we created this speak function. If I say prototype.speak, I'll just get that function back, right? To string, right? So there's that function that I created. It's just stored in dog.prototype.speak. And what happened when I created my pet using up here, new dog China, is JavaScript created an object, and it assigned to that object all of the things from the prototype. So it got the speak function, and then it passed, it ran the constructor and made that object available through the this keyword. So in my constructor, I added name to it. So now if I look at pet and let's see, it's going to show me the name, which is sort of, I don't know if you're familiar with the term own attributes, but that's what they mean by own attributes, right? Name is my pet's own attribute, but it has other attributes that it gets from its prototype, like speak and other things like that. So I can actually say pet.speak, and we'll see that pet.speak, if I print it out, is that same function that lives in dog.prototype.speak, okay? The difference is when I call pet.speak with words, I pass it a string. When I call pet.speak, when that function is invoked over here, because I called it in this way, because I said pet.speak, JavaScript will make this an alias to the object itself. So in this case, inside the sentence, this is always bound to pet, right? Which allows me to say this.name and get the pet's name, get China's name. But if I just call So pet.speak is a function, right? So if I just take that function and I just get another reference to it, right? Let's stick it in a variable called mySpeak. So now mySpeak is that same function. It's a reference to the exact same thing. To string. But if I just call mySpeak with some argument, we'll see that the name is undefined here, right? The function runs, but when it gets to saying this.name, this no longer refers to pet. This doesn't refer to pet, so there is no name attribute. So that's just generally the concept of binding and how this works. Like, so by default, right, in an object-oriented situation, inside an object method, this is always going to be bound to the current object. And that's sort of the default behavior. Does that part make sense? And then I'm going to go on to talk about bind and sort of how you would override the defaults and bind things manually. But does that default behavior make sense about how this holds the current object inside an object method?
I have two questions, if I may.
Yeah.
So the first one is here when you pass an attribute to, I don't know if I'm saying like using the right terminology, but if you wanna pass in an attribute like the dot speak function to the dot constructor on line 5, can you not use the word prototype, just say dot speak? Would that be recognized as a prototype that's been added to the constructor function?
No, you have to say dot prototype.
Okay, and then my follow-on question is that here on line 2, when you say this dot name equals name, I don't see you pass that variable in anywhere in the speak function. You just specify that on line 6 this dot name. So why do we have to assign a variable to this dot name?
Right. So name here is coming from the constructor. So it's an argument that's being passed in. And the reason I have to assign it to this dot name is to actually store it in this object so that I have it available down here on line 6.
Okay.
So, sorry. Here we go. So, if I just tried to reference name here, I would get an undefined variable because name doesn't mean anything in this context, right? Name is an argument that's being passed to a completely different function. So the only way to get access to it in my object method here is to store it in the object itself.
Got it.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And you wouldn't be able to do pet.name on line 6 because of the scope of everything?
Right. And so in this file, index.js, so pet is defined down here, but pet's not defined yet because I haven't created the object yet, right? And even if somehow I did have access to pet here, so if I change this to pet.name, then this function suddenly becomes a little unuseful, right? Because I could say, your pet. I don't know if you have a dog.
I do. His name is Freedom.
Oh, yeah, that's a good dog name. Freedom. Okay, so I wouldn't want to say pet.name here, right? Because that, even if that worked, it would be referencing a specific instance of the dog, right? It would be referencing my dog. But then your dog wouldn't work, right? When I call your pet.speak, then this inside that function is always going to refer to like the object that this method was invoked on, right? And that's kind of what we want. We always want to get the name, if you say your pet.speak, we should see your pet's name, not mine. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Was there another question? I feel like somebody said 2 questions. Did we get to both?
Yeah, that was me. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So that's how this binding works in sort of object-oriented code in JavaScript. So the kicker here is that this is always bound to something. So even in this sort of global namespace here, or in the node terminal, for instance, I can say this and I'll get something, right? Let's see what this is. And it looks like this is a reference to, there's a whole bunch of stuff in this. And you can see it has process. It probably has process.argv in here somewhere. If we go down far enough, there's process.argv. So what we're seeing is that in this context, which is just sort of the global namespace, right? This is actually a reference to the global namespace. So I can say process.argv is just another way of saying this.process.argv. Or PID, I guess, is something else that's stored in there, right? The process ID. So when your program starts, sort of in your global namespace, this is going to refer to, at least in a node process, the sort of that global namespace. All those global variables will be found there. So things like, it looks like also this .dog is in there, like things that anything I've declared in the global namespace. So it's not super useful, but that's what you get by default. So this is always, there's always something in this. By default, it's sort of the global namespace, which is why when we said dog.prototype.speak, if I just call this method this way, I get undefined. I don't get a this is not defined error, right? This is always defined, but it's just so happens that this is bound to that sort of global object. Since I didn't call speak on I didn't invoke speak as like a method on an object that I created. I'm just like calling the function directly. This just takes that global binding. So what I could do, and this is where the interesting thing comes, I can take this speak function, right? So dog.prototype.speak is just a reference to that function. And I can call on it. And call is going to take 2 arguments. Sorry, call is going to take any number of arguments, but in this case, it'll take 2. And the first argument to call is going to be the value that I want to assign to this inside the function. So I could just give an object here and say name Trevor. And then what follows that first argument are just the regular arguments to the function. So our speak function takes a sentence. I'll pass that sentence in. Let's make this bigger. So when I use call this way, call is a way for me to call a function and explicitly say, hey, I want this to have, I want this keyword to be bound to this value, whatever this first argument is. Sort of regardless of what it might have been bound to otherwise. And so I can actually, do I still have my pet here? Yeah, so I still have China here. And even if by default it would be by default it's bound to my pet China, but I can say .call, and again, name, and I can override that. I can override the value of this by using call. So that's call, and bind is similar. So in this case, when you're calling call, you're doing 2 things at once, right? You're saying, I'm calling this method, speak, or I'm calling this function, speak, and I want to bind the value of this inside that function to this first argument, and then I want to pass these other functions to that. I'm sorry, I want to pass these other parameters as parameters to that function. What bind gives you, where call calls the function, bind just returns a new function that has the value of this bound permanently. So, so we could bind and then do this. We could say const So what I've done here is I've called bind on this speak method and passed in a new value for this. And what I've gotten back is a new function that is, it is the speak function. It's sort of a copy of the speak function that is permanently bound to this value of this. So it's, this object is always going to be bound to this when Luther speak is called. So now I can call Luther speak. And if I spell it right, which is a big if, there we go. See, whenever I call Luther, and I can call it as many times as I want with different arguments, and it's always going to be bound to this object over here that I bound it to.
Yep.
Does that make sense?
Trevor, is Luther speak a function or is that an object? Because you originally bound, like, because you used the bind on the pet object.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean that Luther speak is an object with a name property, or is it just a function in this case that
Yeah,
just
no,
calls
it's just
that?
a function. Luther speak, so if we just look at it here, the console will tell us that it's a function, and it'll show us that it's, oh, that's interesting. It'll show us that it's a bound function, right? So Luther speak is a function. I can print out the contents of that function, although it looks like it's bound. Just get this native code. But yeah, Luther speak is just a function that is sort of bound to a specific value for this. Yeah. So where call is going to sort of call the function immediately with certain sort of like temporarily bound to a certain value of this. Bind, it just gives you a new function that is forever bound to whatever object you bound it to. And so this is going to let us do interesting things like, I don't know if I still have, do I still have your pet in here? I don't. Okay, so all right, so we've got freedom. So now I've got my pet and your pet. So I can call my pet speak, call your pet. And now we see that, you know, it's getting freedom instead of China. This is sort of, this is equivalent, right? So this is kind of a no-op, right? If I call pet and pass in the object that I'm calling on in the first place, I get the exact same behavior. And there are a couple of times, so this is something that like is useful some of the time. You don't do this like bind and call and that stuff you use commonly, but it can help in certain circumstances. And I'm trying to think what a good example of that would be. So one example that I've seen is in tests. Let's go look at that. That's probably worth looking at. So one example where you might see this is in tests. Where have any of you done like writing tests where you're trying to assert that the function is going to throw an error? That's something y'all have played with? Okay, yeah. So a lot of times what we might say is on invalid args, right? So you might have something like this. And so often what you do, this is probably the more common case, right? You pass in some anonymous function and then you call your thing. So let's say we've got, let's say we've got a function here called because I'm bad at thinking of examples. You got two numbers, and we say if a is greater than 10, we just have no idea how to add that, throw new error. Okay, so we've got an add function that we expect to throw an error if a is greater than 10, right? So I would say add 11 to 2, and I could say expect that to throw big number or hard. Right, so this is, I guess let me actually. Const expect require shy. Let's actually run this. So we have a working example. I've got Mocha working here.
You've got a typo on line 12 too, where the row is.
Function, what am I missing? Line 12. What's the typo?
At the row, you're missing an R.
Oh, so thank you. Right. Okay. So.
What you doing for lunch?
You know what we need to do?
Oh shit, my bad. Oh, fuck.
Yo, you don't have
I just did that.
to sign up.
Was it an event tonight, bro?
I was, yeah, there's
Okay.
this is
Was it a free one?
yeah, yeah.
Can't find module chai. Ah.
Oh, my bad.
Okay. So x expect is not a function. Okay. So like I was saying, this is how you would normally do this here, right? And so what we're doing, this is sort of a shortcut way of doing this, right? Where we're creating a function, and then we're passing that function to expect, right? And then expect is going to call that function for us, and it's going to call that function for us and then see if it throws an error. And if it does, then it'll, pass the test. And if not, it'll fail the test, right? So this is one way of creating a function, right? Just like writing a literal inline function that does nothing but call add with the arguments 11 and 2. So it turns out there's another way you can do that using bind, which is I can take the add function and I can call bind on it. The first argument to bind is going to be whatever I want to bind this to, and in this case, I don't care what this is, right? Because add doesn't use this. But you can also bind the rest of the arguments of the function. So I can actually create a new function called fun that not only has this bound to null, but has a bound to 11 and b bound to 2. So now this fun function I can just call with no arguments because the arguments are already bound, and I can pass that into expect. You may see this style in like testing. I don't like this as much because bind is just, it confuses people. There's this awkward null where you're binding this, and like who needs to think about this? Shouldn't come into play right now. But it's another use of bind, and it also sort of shows you that bind will take other arguments. And sometimes that can be useful if you want a function to throw around. So for instance, you could, we could write a function make adder. There's a better way to do this. Const. So we could write a function, make adder, that takes some number, and then all right, let's start with an add function. So we could start with an add function that takes two numbers and adds them together, right? So now add adds numbers together. And then we could create a make adder function. And we could say this function is going to build a new function, right? So it's going to take one number, and it is going to turn a new function by using bind, right? So it'll turn a new function that's just add with its first argument bound to whatever x was. So now if I call make adder 5, I'm going to get a function back, which is the add function bound to something in particular. And so this new function we could call add 5. So now whenever I call add 5, please tell me this will work, right? Yeah. Now this function just adds 5 to its argument. Because what's happening is add 5 is calling a bound version of add that already has the first argument bound to 5. So whatever the next thing we pass in will be the second argument. And so we have a little factory here that will create new functions that are just sort of like, it's sort of like the add function, but like pre-packaged with some of the arguments already filled out for you. Anyway, so if I don't have more useful examples of when you would use call and bind, they do tend to come in when you're doing things that are a little bit more advanced, or if people are trying to be clever, you'll see that. But it is useful in some circumstances, so it is a good thing to know about. Any other questions about this?
No, thank you.
Cool. All right. Well, we're a little over the hour, so I'm gonna let y'all go. But thanks for showing up. Thanks for asking good questions. And I will see you all around.
All right. Thanks, Trevor.
Yeah. Oh, apply. Sorry, I didn't get to apply. Apply is really quick. I will do apply. If y'all want to stick around, I will talk about apply. Let me just check my calendar and make sure I'm not blowing into another meeting here. I don't think I am. I'm not. Yay. Okay. Let's talk about apply real quick. So apply. Let's see if I can remember this. So let's go back to this. We've got an add function and apply. If I remember right, apply takes an array. Nope. Wait for it. Yeah, that's what it does. So apply is like call. The only difference is, so it still takes this argument as the first argument, and but instead of taking any number of arguments after this and mapping them to the arguments in the original function, it takes an array as the second argument, and it uses each item in that array as the parameters for the initial function. So in this case, I'm passing an array with 2 items in it, and the first one will get used for A, and the second one will get used for B in the add function. And so that is apply. And apply can be useful in cases where you have an argument, you have a function that takes a lot of arguments, and what you have is like all of those arguments in an array. So an example of this might be console.log. So console.log actually takes any number of arguments. I can pass as many things as I want to console.log, and what it does is it just prints them all out with spaces in between them. So if I happened to have some array that had a bunch of stuff I wanted to print out. Maybe an object, maybe a string. So I have this, if I have this array and I want to just print all this stuff out together with spaces in between, and one thing I could do is say console.log.apply null, because we don't care what this is, and then my array. And this is exactly the same thing as calling log, console.log this way. So I get the exact same result. Whereas if I just called console.log with the array, you'll see it's printing it out with the brackets here because it's showing that it's printing out an array. Where in the other case with apply, it's just printing out as if I called it this way. It's printing out just a bunch of different things, one after the other. It's not printing an array. It's a subtle difference. Does that make sense? Kind of explain apply.
Yes.
Very much like call, it's just pass an array of parameters instead of the parameters individually. Okay, good deal. All right, folks, well, I will see you around. Sorry we went over a little bit. Hope you all have a good Tuesday.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Trevor.